So we're living in a generation where God is about to do something that you would not believe even if you were told. I know we've said that over and over and over again, and that our job is to wait, that God is fighting for us, that our job is to stand, to go out on the battlefield and wait and see the victory that God will win over the enemies that we face, over our oppressors, over the Goliath of our generation. And I know it sounds like we're saying things multiple times, but it's because Scripture says it again and again. Why? Because it's for emphasis. Because in 2 Chronicles 20, we see a chapter where God once again saves his people from an enemy that stands in an impossible situation against the people of Judah. They are surrounded by an enemy, and God tells them the very same thing we've learned for many different videos, many weeks now. We've been learning that God says, look, stand. And in 2 Chronicles 20:17, once again, Judah is surrounded by an enemy. And the king is told through a prophet, you need not fight in this battle. Station yourself, stand and see the salvation of the Lord on your behalf. Stand and see. Same thing Paul said, right? In Paul, when he's talking about the armor of God in Ephesians, he says, put on the armor of God. And when you've done everything, stand. The very thing God told the children of Israel here, the children of Judah. He says, do not fear or be dismayed. Tomorrow, go out and face them, for the Lord is with you. Once again, stand. We need to go out to the battlefield. And what we've learned about going out to the battlefield means that we go out, we don't complain, we believe, which is really what this story is about here. We believe what God says. And what God speaks is he speaks through his prophets. And the question is, are you going to believe God or not? Remember Isaiah, he said, look, God is in charge. He's the creator, he's the king, he's the commander of the armies of the host. There is no reason not to believe him. So the question is really with you. When God speaks through his prophets, are you going to believe? And that's what this story is. Because look, this word came from a prophet. He said, go out and stand on the battlefield. You won't have to fight, but you will see God bring victory for you when you stand and see. And this is the question. You see, the next day, they rose up early in the morning and went out to the wilderness and stood on the battlefield. And the king, Jehoshaphat, said, listen to me, O Judah. He was encouraging them. He says, listen to me, O Judah. In verse 20 of 2 Chronicles chapter 20, it says, listen to me, O Judah, and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Put your trust in the Lord your God, and you will be established. He says, look, believe in God, trust, believe. That's what it is. Faith is really nothing more than trusting in God. Do you trust me? Is what God is saying. I have spoken. Do you trust me? You say, well, how do we know God has spoken? Well, Amos 3:7 tells us that God does nothing except he first reveals it through his prophets. So God does nothing except he first reveals it through his prophets. And then here in this story in 2 Chronicles 20, we see that the prophets spoke and said, go out to the battlefield and stand. Stand, don't complain. Keep your mouth from speaking against the plans of God. Believe. And this is what the king is trying to get them to do. Put your trust in the Lord and you will be established. But he continues. He says, put your trust in his prophets and you will succeed, or you will prosper. You see, God does nothing except he first reveals it to his prophets. And the prophets have spoken. They spoke in this story. And what the king is trying to get the people to do is, do you believe? Do you believe that God spoke? Do you believe that the prophets, what the prophets declared about what God's plan is? See, God has a plan. It is unfolding. And the only question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we believe the plan that God has identified? Do we believe what we've heard? Do we believe in God? And so this is what the people are being asked by the king. Come on, do you believe? Let's stand. Let's do what we were told. Let's stand. Let's not complain. Let's believe. And then he goes on in verse 21 of 2 Chronicles 20. He says, when he had consulted with the people, He appointed those who sang to the Lord. And sometimes we look at this verse and we say they sang and God moved. Well, that's true. That was the order. They sang and God moved. But singing wasn't even a part of God's instructions. God's instructions was to stand. Go out and stand. Simply don't complain about my plan and how it unfolds, and believe in me. Believe the word I spoke through my prophets. When they sang, they weren't singing to produce a victory. They believed in victory, and so they sang. There's a difference. They sang, they consulted with each other, and they said, you know what? We do believe. We do believe what God said. We do believe that his plan is coming to pass. We do believe that he is going to produce a victory for us. We do believe that he is going to remove the enemy that stands before us. We do believe in the freedom that he has declared over us. And we will sing. Why? Because we believe. Not so that God moves, because God is already moving. We're just going to stand. And as we stand, we're going to sing. That's what it says in Hebrews. Hebrews talks about offering a sacrifice of praise. In Hebrews 13, verse 15, it says, through him then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of the lips that give thanks to his name. We need to give thanks. Why? Because we understand the victory, even though it's not seen with our eyes, is just as sure as though it were here. And when we stand on the battlefield before the enemy, the victory is already ours. You see, the battle is the Lord's, but the victory is ours. We stand on the battlefield and God fights for us. We stand and we keep our mouths shut from complaining. We believe in our hearts that God really is going to come through for us. And we sing because we know that his victory is true. And when they began to sing praises, God set ambushes and the enemies were routed. You see, the only question that we have is whether we're going to participate in the victories of God. Because God is bringing victory even as he spoke through his prophets. That victory is assured. The question is, are you going to believe? You see, there was another time in 2 Kings. In 2 Kings, there was another time when God's enemies surrounded the nation of Israel. And there was a famine in the land, and it was so bad that the Bible even says that a donkey's head, they were eating donkey heads. That's how bad it was. So they said a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver. That's more money than anybody wants to pay for a donkey's head. But things were so bad, they had nothing to eat, and they were selling a donkey's head for 80 shekels of silver. They were selling 5 shekels of silver would only buy enough dove dung to light a small fire to heat up food and cook it. And so things were really bad. But Elisha got a word from the Lord and said, listen, in 2 Kings 7:1, it says, then Elijah said, listen to the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time, a measure of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gates of Samaria. So food would go from 80 shekels down to a single shekel. One day of food would sell for almost nothing compared to the famine prices. And there was an officer that was standing next to Elijah and heard what he said. And he said this, behold, if the Lord should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? In other words, he didn't believe. He was standing there with a prophet, Elijah, who declared that God was about to work a miracle. The enemies that had surrounded Israel, surrounded Jerusalem, would be driven away, and prosperity would be restored. And the officer of the army didn't believe it. And he said, could it even happen if God would open up the windows of heaven? And then Elisha said, behold, you will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat of it. In other words, Elisha was declaring that what he had spoken was indeed from God and that it would happen. And because the officer of the army of the king did not believe, he would indeed see it, but he would not participate in it. And in fact, if you read the story, it continues in chapter 7 of 2 Chronicles and said, so it happened just as the man of God had spoken. 2 measures of barley for a shekel, 1 measure of fine flour for a shekel were sold the next day at the gate in Samaria. But the king's servant was trampled by the people at the gate that he had been given charge of by the king. And so he never saw it. And so here's the question. God has spoken through his prophets. We know in Amos he does nothing except he first speaks through his prophets. And I'm not saying if you don't believe what's going to take place that God really is going to remove the head of the Goliath of our generation. He really is going to remove leaders. He really is going to restore righteousness, that the glory of God will be seen. The knowledge of his glory will be seen as the waters cover the sea. If you don't believe that, I'm not saying you're going to get trampled at the gate. Don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is it's going to happen because God spoke it. And what we learn in 2 Chronicles 20, the whole chapter is about believe. Really believe. Stand. Wait. Believe. Go out. Stand on the battlefield. Do not complain about the delay. Do not complain about God's plan. Believe and declare your belief by singing and proclaiming, giving a sacrifice of praise, because you know it will happen because God spoke it. Victory is coming. And I want you to see what comes with victory. You see, in 2 Chronicles 20:25, it says, when Jehoshaphat and his people came to take their spoil, because God did indeed drive away the enemies. They killed each other and lay on the ground before the people of Judah. And when the king and the people came out to take their spoil, they found much among them, including goods and garments and valuable things. And they were 3 days taking the spoil. There was so much. You see, with victory comes natural prosperity. We are not just talking about God removing the oppressors, but we are talking about God removing the chains that oppress us. God is about to release prosperity, even as he has over and over and over and over again in his word. He is fighting for us. He has proclaimed it through his prophets. It's our job to stand and wait on the Lord and believe what he said. And when we do, we will see the victory and we will reap the spoils of the war that God is bringing to us. Prosperity is on its way. Victory is on its way. Stand strong. Believe in the plans of the Lord. Wait. Do not grow weary. Isn't that what it says in Galatians 6:9? In Galatians 6:9, it says what? Hang on. Galatians 6:9 says, let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time or in due season we will reap if we do not grow weary. Stand and reap the prosperity that God has for you in this season of victory. God bless.